Hello and welcome to today's talk. Today I'm going to be talking about the sublimity of introversion. So, primarily, this is about having the right activities and interests to um, further the idea of the sublime. And the kind of activities and interests are um, a lot of the arts like music and literature and perhaps visual art, but also I've put here also spirituality. So uh, spirituality can be very sublime, but a lot of people don't know how to access it or aren't interested in accessing it, which is a shame. But a lot of professed atheists don't have that dimension to their lives, and but everyone has the artistic dimension. Or if you prefer the sciences, for example, there's a lot to be gained from mathematics and theoretical physics. That's not my personal thing, but these are all possible areas of the sublime. So I'll begin with the idea of introversion in the arts. So obviously, when you read a poem to yourself, or read a novel, get immersed in a novel, or even read a work of philosophy, that's a very introverted activity. And you're connecting with some of the greatest thinkers of the last few thousand years. So it's definitely going to have a sublime effect on you. And this isn't necessarily it's not simply an aesthetic effect. It's much more integral than that. It's like it's a combination of factors, but it's basically well, aesthetic, spiritual, emotional, intellectual, um, both rational and I could almost say a super rational. I won't call it irrational because that suggests a denigration of it, but certainly through music, literature, poetry, all these introversive things, music can have your headphones on at night, just listening to a symphony or something, and that can really inspire the sublime. And Schopenhauer has a lot to say about how music music is the closest form of art to reality itself. So that's very powerful. But also in terms of spirituality, for example, prayer, which is very powerful. Now, again, this is like a very divisive subject because a lot of people have never experienced this because we live in an extremely secular society, the most secular in world history, and it's had a effect on people's spiritual dimension. Now, a lot of people rely on their spiritual dimension nowadays in the New Age, for example, and like New Age meditation and things like that. And I'm not too keen on that myself, but some people have that sort of non-conventional spiritual dimension, and some don't have any spiritual dimension at all, but their aesthetic appreciation of art could be thought of as a form of spirituality in a way, because it reminds me of what historians say like in the 19th century in the romantic era. Art broadly replaced spirituality in many people's minds, and art became the new spiritual form, and like the science of aesthetics was born, and like Hegel's and Kant's idea of aesthetics, and all that was established. So it's a tricky one, really, talking about spirituality. certainly the traditional forms, like in my own Catholic belief, are not anywhere near as widespread now. So it's difficult to establish a universal basis for traditional spirituality, because a lot of people simply won't have experienced that, and they won't have any interest in it either. They'll just won't be interested in taking that on as a project. But yes, the idea of sublimity is to reach the heights of being. Now, this is an ontological point, that there's a vertical dimension to reality as well as a horizontal dimension. And the horizontal dimension is the world of the five senses and the rational mind. And the vertical dimension is the more, deeper sense, the spiritual sense, and perhaps intuitive sense, intellectual in the traditional meaning of intellectual as a almost in a Neoplatonic way, as an intellectual principle above reason. And all of these things suggest that we can reach the heights of being through introversive activity. Now, I suppose it's possible to do that extroversively as well, but that's not my own experience. I did a personality test and I was a first percentile introvert, so I think my specialism is really introversion, so I can't speak for the other, but reaching the heights of being is really important, and it's not something that can be automatically switched on and off. Like, it's something that will often appear in sort of flashes of genius in certain works or certain sublime experiences in spiritual practice, or even just a phrase of music which evokes something almost supernatural in the mind. And all of these experiences count towards the heights of being. But I'd like to stress it's not simply an aesthetic or even hedonistic experiences. That's not what I mean at all. Like the Epicureans, the Epicurean philosophy was that contemplation for the sake of pleasure was the highest good. Epicureanism isn't how it was interpreted in the Renaissance as like being really greedy and eating at loads of feasts and things like that. Epicureanism was pleasure through contemplation, but I don't think the purpose of contemplation is ultimately pleasure. The purpose of contemplation is to reach a higher state, and there's a further goal than simply a hedonistic one. But that's Epicureanism. I don't agree with it, but it's also, well, they believed in gods, but it's pretty atheistic, broadly speaking, certainly anti-Christian. But yes, when I mean the heights of being, I mean a nobler philosophy, like, for example, the Platonic philosophy, where we think of connection to the one or to the good, or however you describe it, like in Plato's cave allegory. And yes, that's what the sublime is about. And of course, the classical treatment of it is Longinus, although I would extend my definition from that of Longinus, his treatise on the sublime. I don't have simply a classical definition of the sublime that I'm talking about here, because it incorporates art, spirituality, even the sciences for those that prefer the sciences. But yes, so the sublimity of introversion is about using introversion as a tool to access sublime states, and this all takes place in the privacy of the mind, so it's not something that has an external manifestation necessarily, although certainly a heightened spiritual state can bring about a sense of peace and calm, and you might be more of a stable personality. But it's really not something that is externally manifested, broadly speaking. So it's really a personal journey. It's a personal quest in a way, and we seek sublimity for different reasons. But mine personally is a spiritual reason to try and get closer to God. But an atheist can have their own reasons for seeking sublimity that isn't limited to hedonism. They can have a higher purpose in seeking sublimity, like to further the human mind on the quest of knowledge, or something along those lines. But yeah, so I think I've given a pretty good summary of what I mean by sublimity of introversion through art, the sciences, and spirituality. And that's really what I mean in a nutshell. And I don't think there's much more to say on this subject. Perhaps I've not gone into as much depth as I intended, but it's difficult when you're doing a live video. Yeah, I think that's a sufficient treatment of it. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.